A devoted granddad, his two strapping sons, and grandkids galore.
The DeWilds sort of lived the American dream.
Until one DeWild discovers the only way out of this family is murder.
The hands were tied with rope, and the body had duct tape around the face.
We couldn't rule anybody in the family out.
Every time there was a break in the case, you would think, now they're gonna get the killer. But this was just a very slick criminal.
Welcome to Edgewater, Colorado, a small town paradise just a stone's throw from Denver, with lots of open space and plenty of fresh mountain air.
The quality of life is very good here. The weather is just fantastic. You can't beat sunshine 300 days a year.
Who'd have thought this happy little suburb would become the backdrop for murder? Tucked in among Edgewater's mountain roads is the home of the DeWild family. For the close-knit DeWild clan, Saturday is Boys' Day Out. And it takes more than a little roadkill to ruin a sunny morning. Brothers Danny and David don't mind getting their hands dirty.
My dad and Dan were identical in a lot of ways. A lot of the time they had the same jobs and they did the same hobbies. They just did everything the same.
They were all very mechanically inclined. They were big into automotives. If it had an engine, they played with it.
Danny's son is living proof. The love of gears and gauges runs in the blood. Their talent for tinkering flows from a single source: their father, Don. The master mechanic taught his boys everything they know.
Don was in the mix quite a bit. He enjoyed spending time with his sons, and they likewise enjoyed spending time with him.
Don was a pretty good guy. He raised his sons right, taught them a trade, and worked hard.
With 3 mechanics in the family, it's hard to imagine anything breaking down. Danny, the older brother, is a master of intricate parts and pieces.
He had a train track running through the entire house. You should see, it's phenomenal, running from everywhere, every room in the house.
And while Danny loves toying with trains, his dad and brother prefer to work on bigger engines. On Saturday afternoons, all the DeWild men get down and dirty in Don's auto shop.
Don has a garage called Don's Toy Box, where he tinkers with cars along with his 2 boys, Danny and David.
Dave had some really nice trucks, and I know the father, he had a nice hot rod and bikes. Dan, he liked RC cars.
But the DeWild men know when it's time to set their tools down and head home. Each Saturday evening, the family joins in a feast prepared by Danny's wife, Heather.
My Aunt Heather is a good cook, always makes delicious meals. She has a really big, beautiful smile, and she's really sweet.
Heather's a loving wife and mother, but don't dare cross her.
She was very feisty and could keep her own.
She was a tough cookie, even though she was small.
Heather and Danny's big, inviting home has become a social hub for the entire family.
They had a great family life, a beautiful home. He was a hard worker. She was a doting mom. It was everything that you'd expect in a happy family.
They lived the American dream.
David has a rougher ride. Since his divorce, he's been more focused on having fun than finding the one.
Daniel and Heather were very happy and a very nice couple. David did not have what his brother had.
But he's about to plunge back into the dating pool. David's new girlfriend, 42-year-old Roseanne, makes quite the first impression.
She was older, but she was cute. You saw her, and then that was the end of it, you know what I mean?
For David and Roseanne, it's love at first sight. She's the older woman. He's her loving lad.
She's definitely a fun person. She likes to do stuff outside with motorcycles. She just got along so well with my dad.
Whatever Dave wanted to do, she was up for. I could see the appeal.
David and Roseanne seem to be in hog heaven. But before long, things will spin out of control. David introduces his lady to the family on their annual summer road trip. But the other DeWilds pay Roseanne little attention. The family's veered off course, and Danny's wife, Heather, is in no mood to schmooze.
Roseanne enters the picture. She was older than David, and no one knew a lot about her at all.
A rocky ride in a cramped RV is not helping the family get better acquainted. While Grandpa Don and David argue over directions, Heather is seething over a dark secret.
That's it.
Danny and Heather started to encounter financial problems. It was about an investment that Danny made, and the investment didn't work out. It was a slippery slope for that young family.
The stressed-out mother finally snaps.
What is the problem?
Why is Danny dragging her on an expensive vacation when he can barely make the mortgage?
That's what's wrong.
Kids have always been
And we have no money.
It was not just financial problems.
Why do we even have an RV in the first place?
It was just how they dealt with each other. They argued a lot. And with two small children, it was a big problem.
Even through all this turmoil, no one yet suspects. The whole family is headed straight for a cliff.
Heather shocks everyone
I want a divorce.
You got it!
by asking for the divorce.
seems Danny and Heather's days are numbered, with custody of the kids up in the air. And Father Don, Brother David, and David's girlfriend, Roseanne, are going to feel the repercussions. Coming up, as the divorce heats up, the DeWilds circle the wagons. But too much family can be a very dangerous thing. The tables have turned on the DeWild brothers. David has found love and happiness with his girlfriend Roseanne. And Danny's marriage is crashing and burning.
When Heather announces that she's filing for divorce, she takes the children and moves in with her parents.
The devoted family man is now living all alone in a big, empty house. And isolation doesn't suit him. Roseanne tells Danny that for his own good, he needs some company in his empty nest.
Danny agrees to let his brother David and Roseanne move in.
They took the home that Dan had been living in and divided it in half.
But before long, the three unconventional roommates are in each other's hair. Danny starts feeling suffocated in his own home.
Why does he do that?
And things outside the home aren't much better. Quality time with the DeWild children is now being doled out at Heather's whim. Grandpa Don takes whatever he can get.
One of the things that was a point of contention was custody and visitation.
So you had all the elements for a very hostile environment.
All right, kids, time to go.
The family makes nice for the sake of the kids. But behind the fakery, resentment is simmering and will soon explode into homicidal rage. With family tension at an all-time high, older woman Roseanne gives some sage advice to dejected Danny. If he's serious about saving his marriage and spending time with his children, he'll man up and win Heather back.
Danny went to Heather's parents' home, and he had flowers and a card, and he tried to reconcile with Heather.
But desperation is a lousy cologne.
Heather is unmoved by Danny's last attempt to save the marriage.
She didn't want anything to do with him, and he left the house.
It's the end of a marriage and the start of a horror story that no one in Little Edgewater, Colorado will ever forget. Saturday, July 24th. Around lunchtime, Heather and the kids swing by Danny's house.
Hey, what you guys doing?
He had insurance cards for her kids that she wanted to get.
Danny and his brother David and David's girlfriend Roseanne are there.
Heather drops the two kids off and says, I have to run some errands, and I'll be back.
Danny's thankful for the extra visitation time.
He took the kids that afternoon and they went to a fast food restaurant.
Later that night, Heather's due to pick up the children.
Heather is supposed to return at about 6 o'clock and she doesn't show up. So Danny calls Heather's mother and says she's not here.
Danny sends the kids off with Heather's parents and waits all night for word. But Heather never shows.
After a night of worrying that she doesn't appear, Heather's parents reported her as missing.
There was nothing in her past that would indicate that she would willfully walk away right away. We suspected that she was in some sort of trouble.
The police put out a bulletin about the description of Heather and her vehicle, and it was widely circulated.
"12 days pass with no sign of Heather until a strange discovery.
Heather's car was found in an apartment complex parking lot.
There were no signs of any break-in or carjacking or struggle. It was just sitting there.
The car's spotless interior offers no clues as to Heather's whereabouts.
The windows were rolled down, the keys were in the glove box.
It's a huge alarm that probably Heather wasn't responsible for leaving the vehicle there. I was grateful that we found the car, but we still hadn't found Heather.
Across town, road workers on a remote highway pass are doing some digging of their own.
This was a turnout where the highway department stashes boulders and other debris that kind of come down off the mountain.
What began as a normal workday will soon take a horrifying turn.
A road worker was moving a pile of gravel up Clear Creek Canyon. And when he moved it, he found a body. It was basically in a shallow grave underneath the gravel pile.
A petite female, arms and legs bound with duct tape. And it looks like she's been here some time.
Her body was wrapped in a trash bag and just partially covered.
Jefferson County Homicide Squad descends on the scene. One look at the state of the body, and investigators are sure they're dealing with foul play.
The body was badly decomposed. With the duct tape that was on the body, this was very reasonably a homicide, and they treated it like that.
CSI agents search the dusty corpse for clues. and find some unsettling scraps of evidence among the rocks and debris.
The hands were tied with rope. There was electrical tape covering the knots.
Strangest of all, her face wears a death mask made of duct tape. Detectives have a pretty good idea who's beneath the veil.
The body was attired in the clothing that Heather was last seen in, according to her family.
Has some sort of monster come to Edgewater in search of prey? Is the silver mask his calling card? Or is the real killer someone she knew?
It was very unlikely that Heather just disappeared and coincidentally was strangled by a stranger.
Coming up, police sniff out the stench of death at the DeWild family home. There's trouble in Colorado Paradise after construction workers make a gruesome discovery.
In Edgewater, a murder is very unusual.
In any investigation, all possibilities have to be looked at and explored. You have to go where the evidence takes you. And the possibility that this had been some type of a stranger abduction and that her body was placed up there by somebody that had just randomly kidnapped her or abducted her, it was always a possibility.
Dental records quickly confirm the remains are in fact those of Heather DeWild. But how she died remains a mystery.
We had been monitoring the actual jurisdiction that the body was located in, and because obviously Heather had not been located, we stayed in very close touch and actually had representatives at the coroner's office when her body was brought in. The dental records are required by the coroner's office, and they have to do investigation just like anybody else.
Every person has a unique bite pattern and teeth, size, arrangement, etc. So a coroner will take the teeth from the body and match them to known dental records of a person.
The ultimate identification of Heather's body was made through her dental records.
The Jefferson County Coroner's Office had trouble determining the cause of death because of the decomposition of the body. There were no bullet holes, there were no knife wounds.
She had a skull fracture, but that was even debatable. One expert said that was probably a post-mortem injury caused by the front end loader. The body had ligature marks around the neck. The ligature marks did point to maybe strangulation or hanging.
While the coroner can't be sure how Heather died, detectives know exactly where to start their investigation.
We knew that she was at Danny's house. That was the last place that anyone reported seeing her. So that is the obvious and logical first place for us to start.
But everyone insists they have no idea what happened to Heather.
Danny and David and Roseanne say that Heather dropped the kids off and she left. And Danny was home, and Danny said that she'd go shopping.
estranged husband Danny doesn't seem bent out of shape. But maybe that's because Heather's death is actually good news for his bottom line.
The timing of the divorce as related to Heather's disappearance was extremely suspicious to us.
The heat is on. But Danny, an obsessive budgeter, can back up his story.
Danny provides a receipt for the fast food restaurant where he took the kids on the day that Heather disappeared.
The receipt is time-stamped 1:36 p.m. Barely an hour after Heather dropped off the kids.
And when he produced that, he had an alibi for that particular time.
It seems impossible for Danny to kill his wife, bury her, and ditch her car, all within such a narrow time frame. And with the kids there, no less. But he's not off the hook quite yet.
They asked permission to search the residence. That was granted.
What they're searching for is the smell of death.
The bloodhounds are trained in human remains.
Bloodhounds go through this entire home.
They looked through the house. They didn't find anything.
Nothing came of it. Wow, maybe he doesn't have anything to do with it.
But there's one more place to search. David DeWild's SUV. The vehicle's spotless interior belies a nasty secret.
As soon as the bloodhound climbs into David's vehicle, it starts barking like crazy.
Seems David's been carting around a dead passenger.
At that point, David is pretty well cemented as the #1 suspect.
Curiously, their prime suspect is already down at the county courthouse. But he's not here to confess. David and Roseanne are here to see a justice of the peace.
The fact that Roseanne immediately marries David after the dog hit on a scent is, if nothing else, interesting and unusual.
David and Roseanne's marriage did one thing. It assured them they'll never testify against each other.
In Colorado, a wife isn't compelled to testify against her husband.
With him marrying her, it sets the field up for bringing the detectives even in closer on David. The suspicion goes even higher for him.
But David sticks to his original story. How his SUV acquired the subtle aroma of a corpse, he has no idea.
He absolutely, emphatically says that he is not involved in anything to do with Heather's disappearance.
David said that the afternoon of the disappearance that he was at his father's garage.
David's new bride also claims the day was uneventful.
Roseanne stated that she took the children into another room and kept them occupied while Daniel and Heather discussed the insurance issues. And after she finished with the children, she went on upstairs and watched TV.
Police subpoena David, Roseanne, and Danny DeWild's phone records. Hoping to find out what really happened the afternoon Heather disappeared. Records show over 13 calls between the three of them in a 4-hour period. Idle chatting or minute-by-minute updates on a murder in progress.
The cell phone activity is just another level of suspicion. It would confirm other information, but in and of itself does not prove or necessarily disprove anything.
While they wait on the phone records, suspicion is all the investigators have. With no way to prove the body in David's back seat was his sister-in-law's, they're forced to cut David and Roseanne loose.
We had the evidence in David's SUV. A body had been transported in that car, but we still had no crime scene.
Where was Heather killed? If they could find the location, they could probably find forensics and probably find a killer.
Even in a small town like Edgewater, the attacker would have needed an out-of-the-way place to bind and mask the victim. And one DeWild family member owns such a dungeon. Don DeWild's Auto Shop, where David claims to have been the afternoon Heather disappeared.
The police wanted to search Don's garage to see if there was any sort of evidence that Heather had been there, that perhaps a murder could have been committed there.
Don DeWild was basically willing to do anything to help, but didn't want to do anything.
Don DeWild is a little hostile in regard to the investigation. Kind of a grumpy old man. The search of Don's garage turns up nothing.
Maybe the killer just did a good job cleaning up. Police now find themselves at a maddening impasse.
We had the strong circumstantial case, but there was no direct evidence. There wasn't any smoking gun.
Seems certain some member of the DeWild family did Heather in. But which one? Did husband Danny take revenge on his estranged wife for ruining the marriage? Was father-in-law Don so desperate to keep his grandkids, he used his garage as a human chop shop? Did brother-in-law David kill Heather to defend his siblings' honor? Or did Roseanne anoint herself queen of the DeWild family by taking out Heather herself? For now, no one's spilling the beans.
From my point of view, it certainly looked like the DeWilds got away with murder.
Coming up, just when it seems the case of the duct-tape divorcee will never be solved, new technology places one family member center stage. It's spring 2009, and the case of murdered mother Heather DeWild remains unsolved.
I would always pray to God to send messages to Heather for me. You know, just tell her I said hi and that I loved her.
The community consensus was that it was somebody among the DeWilds that was involved with her death and disappearance. People speculated that maybe they could get away with this crime.
Finally, browsing through reams of evidence, a cold case detective finds one stone unturned.
Back when the murder occurred, locating where a cell phone call had been made was not something that was available.
But since the time those calls were made, they had new technology, this geolocating technology for cell phones.
Police already have records on 13 calls made between suspects, David, Roseanne, and Danny DeWild, on the day Heather disappeared. Now to see where those calls originated.
It's a wonderful thing because they can actually take a cell phone and ping it from tower to tower and triangulate where someone is.
Sure enough, one family member's phone did ping a cell tower near Heather's abandoned car.
David's cell phone actually pinged at the site that Heather's car was left.
Seems Heather's sad sack brother-in-law has been lying all along.
This mounting evidence really was pointing the finger at David DeWild as the killer of Heather DeWild.
Brother-in-law, David DeWild.
There was no other explanation for it. He was making the calls to his brother from that location.
And calls to his wife Roseanne as well. Just what were these three chatting about?
Based on the new evidence they found with the cell towers and connecting the cell phones and the telephone calls with David, Daniel, and Roseanne, they were all three arrested and charged with murder.
But proving a conspiracy is notoriously difficult. Unless David DeWild flips, Danny and Roseanne will surely walk. Could one brother ever rat out the other?
David is under a lot of heat, and he confesses. And makes a deal.
And it must have been exceedingly difficult for David DeWild to turn on his brother, who he's been with literally his entire life.
In exchange for a 12-year sentence, David finally reveals the shocking details of what went down that murderous afternoon. The plot begins with husband Danny luring Heather to his home with the kids' insurance cards.
Danny asked Roseanne to take the children into another room and occupy them for a few minutes so that they could talk insurance. But he first wanted to show Heather something in the garage. When Danny took Heather to the garage, David was there, and she turned to Dan and said, "What did you want to show me out here?"
That's when Danny throws Heather down on the cement floor.
And Danny comes up behind her and hits her in the head with a mallet.
But the worst is yet to come.
They hoisted her into the rafters of the garage on a pulley system.
It takes several long minutes. for her to finally suffocate.
What was really shocking is that the dad would do this while the kids were just a few feet away.
The brothers bind Heather's hands and create a duct tape mask, making it look like the work of some ritualistic killer.
Heather's body was wrapped in trash bags and placed in David DeWild's car, and he went and dumped the body.
It's quite a story, but one chapter seems to be missing. David's confession does not directly implicate his wife, Roseanne, who was watching Danny's kids when Heather was murdered.
David didn't want Roseanne caught up in it. He didn't provide any evidence at all about what Roseanne had or had not done.
Roseanne spends 8 months in prison, and then the charges were dropped against her.
Maybe she didn't even realize what was going on. But people did not speculate kindly about Roseanne.
Don DeWild was also cleared of any involvement. Heather's husband, Danny, the alleged mastermind, elects to go to trial,
My brother walks through, closes the door.
where his brother David's videotaped confession plays for a packed courtroom.
Throws her down hard.
I have a brother that's very close in age to me. I couldn't imagine being in the same situation and, testifying against him or him doing it to me. I couldn't do it.
In the end, Brother David's testimony strips Danny of his will to fight.
Faced with his brother's testimony implicating him, Danny finally says, "Yeah, I did it."
He pleads guilty to his wife Heather's murder.
The motive was basically the money because with the payment on that fairly large house and the child support, he thought that a divorce it was wrecking his life.
Danny's sentenced to 75 years in prison. He will be 70 years old before he's eligible for parole.
A decade on, the horror of Heather DeWild's murder still lingers in this tiny Colorado town.
On the one level of the justice system, it is definitely a success. It was hard fought and hard won. But then when you look at Heather's family, you also have to realize that while this may be a bit of resolution for them, it's not closure.
Danny and David.
On the morning of April 20th, 1999, the sky over Littleton, Colorado seemed to hold itself in that pale, undecided light that belongs to spring in the foothills, when the air can feel clean enough to promise renewal, and yet still carry a thin bite of winter in its lungs. Cars rolled into the parking lots around Columbine High School with the ordinary impatience of a school day. Tires whispered over asphalt still cool from the night. Backpacks thudded against lockers. Sneakers squeaked along waxed floors. The cafeteria began to fill with the loose, scattered energy of lunch preparations, gossip, unfinished homework, flirtations. The mild dramas of teenage life arranged in clusters that felt permanent to the people inside them and invisible to everyone else. Teachers moved through hallways with papers tucked beneath their arms, coffee cooling in paper cups, minds divided between lesson plans and attendance sheets. Outside, students crossed the campus without any reason to think that the day would carry their names into the history of American grief. Nothing in the color of the sky warned them. Nothing in the brick of the building told them that by afternoon the school would be known not for its teams, not for its classes, not for its graduations and dunces, but for blood on library carpet, for shattered glass, for alarms and sirens, and a terror so public it would spread far beyond Colorado and settle into the nervous system of the country. There are certain days that divide time into before and after, and for the United States, for families who sent children to school believing in the routine miracle of their safe return, for journalists and lawmakers and principals and parents, for teenagers who learned to hear a fire alarm differently after that spring. April 20th became one of those dates. It entered memory not as a page in a calendar but as a wound. Columbine was not the first school shooting in American history, but it became the one that altered the national imagination with brutal force. It was the event that seemed to tell the country that violence could arrive not only in dark alleys, not only in distant cities, not only in places already marked by fear, but in the broad daylight of suburbia, inside a school whose appearance was as familiar and unremarkable as thousands of others. It happened in a place people associated with lawns, with carpools, with soccer practice and mountain views, with the reassuring fiction that danger always belongs somewhere else. That fiction died at Columbine. What unfolded that day would take 12 students and 1 teacher, leave many others wounded in body and memory, and end with the 2 perpetrators dead by suicide. But numbers, though necessary, have a coldness that the human mind sometimes uses as shelter. 12 students and 1 teacher can be spoken in a sentence. The reality was a sequence of interrupted heartbeats, unfinished futures, chairs left empty at kitchen tables, jackets hanging where their owners would never reach for them again. It was the sudden collapse of dozens of small private worlds. A mother waiting for the sound of the front door would instead face a silence that would never end. A friend would replay the last joke, the last lunch, the last glance in the hallway with the desperate superstition that memory might somehow reopen a sealed door. A town would discover that grief has geography, that certain curbs, certain stairwells, certain windows could become sacred and unbearable at once. In the first chaos of that day, facts moved more slowly than fear. Students ran from the building and across the grounds with expressions too stripped down to be called expressions at all, faces locked by the primitive command to survive. Some did not understand what they had heard. Some thought it was a prank, a senior stunt, a firecracker, construction noise, anything but the truth. Then came the sound no school community ever fully forgets once it has heard it, the stuttering crack of gunfire where there should have been only laughter, bells, scraping chairs, the soft bureaucratic music of a normal day. Sirens gathered from every direction. Deputies, police officers, paramedics, firefighters, journalists, helicopters, parents in panic, all began converging on the campus, each arrival widening the circle of alarm. Television would carry the images across the nation with a kind of stunned repetition. Teenagers climbing out windows, hands raised, police crouched behind vehicles, smoke drifting from the building. Students running in lines with their heads lowered, mothers clutching one another near police tape, fathers searching faces in the crowd for one face only. America watched in real time as uncertainty hardened into horror. And because the cameras stayed, because the footage looped and looped, because frightened children gave breathless interviews before shock had even settled properly into their bones, the country did not merely hear about Columbine. It witnessed fragments of it, and in witnessing them began to absorb the event not only as news but as ritual trauma. Even now, the name carries more than location. It carries an atmosphere. A library with blinds and books and sunlight turned into a chamber of death. A cafeteria alive with lunchtime noise turned into a place of abandonment and evidence markers. Hallways meant for passing periods became channels of smoke and terror. The ordinariness of the setting intensified everything. A battlefield is expected to contain violence. A school is built to contain beginnings. That contradiction is part of why Columbine tore so deeply into the American mind. Schools had long been sold as controlled spaces, imperfect but fundamentally protected, places where authority, architecture, and routine together formed a wall against the chaos outside. Columbine revealed how fragile that wall could be. It exposed the helpless gap between preparedness on paper and catastrophe in motion. It also exposed the speed with which myth begins to grow over violence. Almost immediately, stories swarmed the event like smoke on a flame. There were rushed assumptions about motives, about social cliques, about revenge, about warning signs missed or misunderstood, about youth culture, bullying, video games, music, morality, trench coats, alienation, rage. Some of those narratives would prove incomplete, some would prove false, but all of them testified to the same desperate need, the need to make terror explainable. When something this monstrous happens in a place so recognizable, people reach for a simple shape to contain it. They want a reason proportionate to the pain, a clean thread through the labyrinth. Columbine resisted that. It still does. The event became not only a crime scene but a mirror. Into it the nation poured its anxieties about children, masculinity, suburbia, access to weapons, media spectacle, untreated mental suffering, institutional blindness, and the possibility that underneath the smooth surface of everyday life some forms of despair and hatred can grow unnoticed until they burst outward in irreversible ways. Yet before all the debates, before policy language and televised panels and moral panic, there was a morning, there were living people inside a school. There was a teacher preparing for class. There were students thinking about lunch, prom, homework, weekend plans, crushes, sports, graduation, the thousand ordinary preoccupations of being young and not knowing how brief safety can be. The deepest horror of Columbine lies there, in the collision between routine and ruin. One moment contains the mundane texture of adolescence, and the next it has been replaced by the logic of emergency, where every second matters and every doorway becomes a gamble. Even the weather seems cruel in retrospect. It was not a storm day, not a day darkened into warning by nature. It was a bright day, the kind that suggests continuation. Spring has always carried a symbolic innocence in American storytelling. Columbine took place in that season and stained it. Afterward, every school lockdown drill, every news report about a threatened campus, every parent waiting for a child to text back from school would echo, however faintly, with that April afternoon. This is part of what it means to say Columbine reshaped the American cultural script around school attacks. It was not merely that policies changed, though they did. It was not merely that security measures multiplied, though they did. It was that the collective imagination changed. A door propped open, a backpack left unattended, a fire alarm during class, a rumor passed from one student to another. All these things began to feel different in a post-Columbine America. The events settled into language, into training manuals, into political speech, into parenting fears, into the architecture of schools themselves. Metal detectors, surveillance cameras, school resource officers, active shooter drills, threat assessment teams, lockdown vocabulary, the grim rehearsal of escape routes and hiding places. All of these belong in some way to the afterlife of Columbine. So does the media template that followed, the endless search for manifestos and motives, the repeated broadcasting of perpetrators' faces until the country began to question whether notoriety itself had become part of the contagion. So does the cultural unease around how young men are taught to carry humiliation, anger, entitlement, and despair. And so does the sorrowful recognition that once one such attack is made famous, others may study its shadow. But on that first day, none of those long consequences had names yet. There was only confusion, gunfire, smoke, blood, and the raw animal sound of survival. There were students hiding beneath tables, praying without structure, bargaining silently with a universe that had become suddenly mechanical and cruel. There were wounded bodies on the grass outside. There were emergency radios crackling with incomplete information. There were law enforcement decisions being made under pressure and later examined for years with the merciless clarity of hindsight. There were parents gathered in designated reunification areas, discovering that hope can coexist with dread until the moment a name is read, until the moment a child appears, or does not. In every tragedy that becomes historic, there is a danger that history will flatten the human pulse of the event. Names become lists, lives become case files, the dead become symbols. Columbine has suffered from that flattening as much as any modern American crime. The perpetrators became cultural reference points, their images reproduced and analyzed with a fixation that often threatened to eclipse the people they destroyed. Yet the true story does not begin with their mythology, it begins with a community that believed itself ordinary and was therefore vulnerable in the most human way. It begins with boys and girls who still had acne, still rolled their eyes at adults, still worried about tests and weekends, and whether they belonged. It begins with a teacher who went to work expecting to return home. It begins with families who did what families do every weekday morning across the country, waking children, packing lunches, reminding them not to be late, moving through routine as though routine were a promise. That promise was broken so violently on April 20, 1999, that the fracture line is still visible in American life. To tell the story of Columbine is not only to recount a massacre, it is to enter the moment when a nation's assumptions about safety, adolescence, violence, and spectacle began to shift under its feet. It is to look at the contrast between the calm face of a suburban school morning and the inferno hidden inside the Nexar. It is to understand that what was lost there cannot be measured solely in the dead, terrible as that number is. Something else died too, a certain innocence about schools, about warning signs, about the distance between fantasy and action, about how quickly violence can rewrite the meaning of a place. And in that widening silence after the sirens, after the helicopters, after the cameras captured children climbing from broken windows into sunlight they would never again experience as simple, the name Columbine began its transformation from a school into a symbol, from a local catastrophe into a national threshold, from one terrible day in Colorado into a lasting chapter in the American story of fear, grief, memory, and the desperate, unfinished search to understand how such darkness entered a building filled with the ordinary brightness of young lives. By the spring of 1999, Columbine High School stood in Jefferson County, Colorado, as the kind of place many Americans had been taught to read as safe before they had ever set foot inside it. Littleton, and the communities around it, carried the visual language of suburban reassurance. There were broad roads, trimmed lawns, pickup trucks in driveways, shopping centers, church parking lots, baseball fields, and the long, open presence of the Rocky Mountain foothills beyond the edges of daily life, always there like a painted backdrop that made the ordinary feel blessed. To the outside eye, it was a world arranged around predictability. Parents went to work, teenagers went to school, the seasons turned invisible ways, and the future seemed to move along familiar rails toward graduation, college, jobs, marriage, and the small dignities of adulthood. Columbine High School itself reflected that atmosphere. It was not an isolated building in some forgotten place. It was a large suburban school with its own rituals, hierarchies, ambitions, embarrassments, clubs, teams, gossip currents, and unwritten codes. The kind of institution where hundreds of lives ran alongside each other every day without ever fully touching. In hallways like those, popularity could feel like a currency more powerful than money. Athletic success could shape identity. Clothes, posture, lunch tables, music taste, social confidence, and the ability to laugh at the right moment all mattered more than adults usually understood. A school is never just a building. It is an emotional weather system. Every corridor holds invisible borders. Every table in a cafeteria can become a kind of territory. For some students, the campus feels like a stage on which they know exactly how to stand. For others, it feels like a maze of exposures, a place where every glance might contain judgment. Columbine was no exception. It was a school with pride in its teams and traditions, a school with students who moved through adolescence under the ordinary American pressures of the late 1990s. But beneath that ordinary appearance were the tensions that often live inside teenage institutions without adults fully grasping their force. The late 1990s now look, from a distance, like the last bright edge of a certain American innocence. The internet existed but had not yet colonized every waking hour. Many homes still gathered around evening television. School days still ended with payphones, after-school jobs, parking lot conversations, handwritten notes, and the hum of desktop computers in bedrooms where teenagers were beginning to discover how digital life could widen private obsession. Music channels, video games, movies, alternative subcultures, and adolescent anger all stirred together in a national conversation that was already nervous about youth, but had not yet learned how to speak about school massacres with the exhausted familiarity that would come later. In 1999, people still tended to imagine mass violence in schools as something exceptional enough to shock the bones of the country. The idea that a suburban high school could become the site of a nationally broadcast slaughter still felt, to many, almost impossible until it happened. That is what made the context of Columbine so important. It unfolded at the intersection of a specific community and a broader national mood. America at the time was prosperous by many surface measures. The economy was strong, popular culture was loud, ironic, restless, and often obsessed with image. Public debate about teenage behavior was already simmering, focused on everything from music lyrics to trench coats to violent entertainment. Adults worried that they were losing their grip on a generation raised amid rapid media saturation and loosening social certainty. Yet many of those worries were diffuse, moralized, and shallow. What people often missed was the private architecture of alienation, resentment, fantasy, and psychological collapse that can grow inside ordinary settings while the outside remains calm. Columbine became the point where all these anxieties converged. The school had the familiar social layers of a large campus. Athletes, theater kids, students in vocational tracks, students bound for college, loners, social climbers, rebels, drifters, the devout, the cynical, the frightened, the adored, the ignored. Teenagers form ecosystems quickly, and those ecosystems can be cruel not always because cruelty is organized, but because indifference is. A shove in a hallway, a muttered insult, an eye roll, a drink thrown for amusement, a nickname that sticks, a joke repeated too long. The tiny humiliations of adolescence can accumulate inside a young mind until they become evidence of a worldview. Not every wounded teenager becomes dangerous. Most do not. Most suffer, adapt, withdraw, find one friend, survive, grow older. But in the landscape surrounding Columbine, the subject of bullying would become one of the most contested and emotionally charged pieces of the aftermath because the school, like many others, contained both visible confidence and invisible pain. Students who felt secure within its social order might remember a mostly normal environment. Students who felt excluded or targeted might describe the same place as a theater of daily contempt. Both realities can exist in one building at once. That is part of what makes schools so difficult for adults to read clearly. A principal may see schedules, activities, and discipline reports. A teacher may see classrooms. A teenager sees rank, vulnerability, humiliation, desire, and fear playing out minute by minute in the spaces between adult supervision. Columbine's context cannot be understood without that emotional geography, nor can it be understood without the American fixation on appearances. Suburban spaces often rely on the performance of stability. Families work hard to preserve the impression that things are fine or manageable, or at least no worse than anyone else's troubles. Houses look neat from the curb, cars leave in the morning, lawns get cut, problems retreat indoors. Mental distress, especially in teenagers, can be dismissed as attitude, moodiness, rebellion, or a phase. Anger can look like style. Withdrawal can look like sullenness. Obsession can pass for eccentricity. Parents, teachers, and peers may all notice fragments without seeing the shape they form together. In the years before Columbine, those fragments existed within a system not yet trained to think in terms of targeted school violence. Today, schools use phrases like threat assessment, behavioral warning signs, leakage risk factors, intervention pathways. In 1999, much of that language either did not exist in common practice or had not yet become part of school safety culture. The country lacked a developed framework for recognizing the possibility that students might plan large-scale massacres inside their own school. There had been earlier attacks elsewhere, but Columbine would become the event that forced institutions to imagine these acts not as aberrant lightning strikes, but as scenarios requiring preparation, intelligence sharing, and prevention models. Before that shift, warning signs could remain scattered across different corners of the adult world. One authority might know about a troubling incident, another might hear about a threat. A parent might glimpse anger without knowing its scale. A peer might dismiss a dark statement as a performance. Law enforcement might not yet see a clear threshold for decisive action. Schools often believed danger would announce itself more openly than it does. The context of Columbine also included access to weapons, access to grievance, access to the fantasy of spectacle. The United States has long joined adolescence to mythology. Boys in particular are often raised on contradictory lessons. They are told to be strong but not taught how to process shame. They are told dominance matters, while vulnerability is suspect. They absorb cultural stories in which humiliation demands reversal, in which manhood is measured against power, in which rage can masquerade as identity. Most boys do not turn these lessons into violence, but for some damaged minds, humiliation can become combustible when paired with entitlement and fantasy. It would later force a country to confront not only school safety but masculinity itself, the performance of hardness, the allure of destruction, and the appetite for notoriety in a media culture that could transform killers into infamous symbols overnight. By 1999, news media had already learned the economics of spectacle. When horror happened, cameras arrived fast. Live coverage rewarded drama, repetition, and immediacy, often before accuracy. The nation had entered an era in which violent acts could be consumed almost instantly as public theater. This mattered because Columbine did not simply occur, it was televised into the American household. But even before the cameras descended, the broader cultural stage was set. The late 20th century had sharpened anxieties about moral decline, adolescent media consumption, and the possibility that violent imagery might leak into real life. Debates about movies, music, games, and youth subcultures often relied on blunt simplifications. It was easier for adults to blame symbols than to understand loneliness, sadism, psychological disturbance, identity fracture, and the seductive dream of apocalyptic control. Columbine would intensify all those debates, but their roots were already present in the national atmosphere before April 20th. The school itself, meanwhile, was moving through an ordinary academic year. Seniors were looking toward the end of high school. Younger students were still trapped in the elastic sense of time that adolescence creates, when a month can feel endless and a year can feel like a continent. Teachers were managing lessons, grading papers, planning around spring schedules. Athletic seasons continued, social alliances shifted in the usual ways. There would have been laughter in hallways, irritated sighs over homework, gossip about relationships, arguments patched over by lunch, and the small private dramas that seem enormous when one is 16. that normality matters because catastrophe never arrives into emptiness. It arrives into routines. It tears through plans already in motion. On the morning of the attack, students and staff were not moving through a place defined by danger. They were moving through a place defined by habit. The contrast between the familiar and the unspeakable is one reason the event seared itself so deeply into public consciousness. Columbine did not look like a place where history expected carnage. It looked like a place history would pass by. There is also the matter of the community beyond the school. Jefferson County was not a blank landscape. It carried the culture of western suburbs shaped by family life, property ownership, religious communities, outdoor identity, and a civic belief in order. Many residents likely assume that the gravest dangers facing teenagers came from the usual list: drugs, drunk driving, depression, pregnancy, aimlessness, maybe occasional fights. The idea that students might carry out a coordinated massacre inside school walls belonged, for most, to a realm outside expectation. This gap between perceived danger and actual vulnerability would later haunt both the local community and the nation. The attack exposed how thoroughly Americans had separated the image of safe communities from the reality that violence can grow within them. Evil did not arrive from elsewhere. It emerged from within a structure people trusted. That realization felt like contamination. If this could happen at Columbine, then perhaps no school, however clean its hallways or prosperous its district, could claim innocence through geography alone. The context surrounding the victims also deserves attention. They were not abstract representatives of youth. They were students living inside the textures of late adolescence, a period full of unfinished becoming. Teenagers are often spoken about by adults in lazy categories, but each one carries a world still under construction. Friendships at that age are absolute. Embarrassments can feel terminal. Love can feel final. Hopes are vivid because they are still untested. To harm young people in a school is to strike them in a place meant to shape that becoming. Columbine's victims were not on a battlefield or in a reckless pursuit of danger. They were in classrooms, hallways, the library, the cafeteria, places that symbolized learning and future. This is part of why school violence creates a special form of public grief. It offends not only against life but against sequence. It shatters the expected order in which the young outlive the old, in which education leads outward into adulthood, in which a school day ends with students coming home. By 1999, America was also living in a contradiction that Columbine would expose with brutal clarity. The nation celebrated youth while often failing to listen to it. It marketed rebellion, sold alienation back to teenagers as style, and then seemed startled when some forms of adolescent despair hardened into dangerous fantasy. Adults often notice the surface language of youth culture, but not the emotional realities underneath it. At the same time, many institutions lacked the imagination to recognize that a young person's violent talk or written rage could be more than theatrical darkness. Schools were built to educate, not to decode the architecture of potential mass murder. Parents were built by hope. They wanted to believe mood swings were temporary, that anger would burn out, that strange interests were phases, that tomorrow would reset what today unsettled. Communities were built by trust. They did not want to suspect their own children or neighbors of catastrophic intent. Columbine entered this web of hope, blindness, performance, and routine like a blade. Its context, then, was larger than one school but smaller than a nation. It lived in the daily life of a suburban campus, in the cultural anxieties of the late 1990s, in the limitations of institutional awareness, in the ordinary social violences of adolescence, in access to weapons and the mythology of power, in the media environment that turned horror into public spectacle, and in the American habit of mistaking a polished surface for a stable interior. All of that formed the air around Columbine before the attack itself began. To understand the massacre, one must first understand that it did not erupt in a void. It emerged from a recognizable world, a world of lockers and parking lots, after-school plans and family dinners, church-going neighbors and teenage grievances, all existing beneath the broad Colorado sky that gave no sign of what would happen. That is the dreadful truth of the context. It was not a world already marked as monstrous. It was a world many people would have envied for its normality. And because it looked so normal, what happened there would feel not only tragic but revelatory, as though the country had been forced to see that beneath the rituals of suburban safety there can exist unseen chambers of rage, fantasy, and despair, waiting for the day routine opens the door and lets them into history. What survives after an atrocity is never only blood evidence, timelines, and official reports. What survives, and what continues breathing long after the television trucks are gone and the crime scene tape has been peeled away, is the human voice. It is the voice that shakes while describing the sound of footsteps between bookshelves. It is the voice that pauses in the middle of a sentence because memory has not aged into something easier, only something familiar. It is the voice of someone who was young enough, on the morning of April 20th, 1999, to still believe that a school day belonged to routine and not to history. When people speak of Columbine now, they often begin with the scale of the massacre, with the victims lost, with the national shock, with the policy shifts that followed. But inside the event itself there were students and teachers whose experience cannot be reduced to a headline or a count. There were people who saw the ordinary world split open from the inside. Part of understanding Columbine means listening as closely and as gently as possible to the human testimony left behind by those who endured it and by the families who had to speak for those who never came home. Their statements do not form one neat chorus. They arrive in fragments, in remembered sounds, in flashes of color, in the peculiar precision of trauma, where a person may forget the order of minutes, but remember the way sunlight struck a table or the way a sneaker scraped against carpet while someone tried not to breathe. That is how terror settles into the body, not as one clear film, but as 1,000 sharp pieces. For students who survived, the day did not begin as tragedy. It began as every school day begins, with sleepy impatience, with conversations half finished from the day before, with the small private concerns that seem so complete when one is young. Someone worried about a class, someone thought about lunch, someone laughed at a friend's joke and never imagined that joke would become the last ordinary sound before panic erased the rest of the morning. In the hours and years that followed, many survivors described the same transformation with haunting simplicity. One moment they were students, the next they were hiding, running, bleeding, praying, or lying still and trying not to make a sound. There is an awful humility in these recollections. No one narrates themselves like a hero in real time. They speak instead of confusion, of disbelief, of instinct. They talk about not understanding what they were hearing at first. A popping noise could be anything in a school, a firecracker, construction, a prank. The human mind resists horror in its first moments. It reaches for smaller explanations because the larger one is too enormous to enter all at once. Then comes the second realization, the one that changes everything, that noise is not harmless, that shouting is not play. Those students are not running because of a drill. And once that realization lands, the body takes over. Testimony from Columbine is full of doors, tables, windows, shelves, grass, pavement hands. Students remember being pressed against surfaces, pulled by friends, shoved toward exits, flattened beneath desks, crouched in corners, crawling through spaces that felt suddenly too open and too exposed. Some remembered seeing injuries they were too young to process. Others remembered not looking directly, because survival narrowed the field of vision to the next movement, the next hiding place, the next second. One of the most painful truths in survivor accounts is how quickly adolescence vanishes under threat. The same students who, minutes before, had been living inside the casual rhythms of youth found themselves making adult calculations under impossible pressure: stay or run, hide or move, help someone or risk drawing attention, pretend to be dead or pray to remain unseen. Trauma ages the mind in an instant. It takes the ordinary softness out of a day and replaces it with a brutal clarity. Yet even in that clarity, many survivors later describe a strange fog, as if memory itself had been burned at the edges. Time stretched, moments slowed and shattered, sounds became louder than sight. The scrape of a chair, the slam of a door, the breaking of glass, the distant scream, the footsteps that came closer and then farther away, all of these lived in recollection with terrible force. If the victims who died cannot speak, the survivors carry part of that silence with them. That burden appears again and again in the way they later describe the event. Some felt guilt for having lived, some felt guilt for running, some felt guilt for not being able to help friends. Some felt guilt simply because chance had spared them when chance had not spared the person beside them. This is one of the cruelest afterlives of mass violence. Survival is treated from the outside as a blessing, and it is, but from within it can feel like a question with no answer. Why this table and not that one? Why this hallway and not the other? Why this wound and not death? Why did I leave when someone else did not get the chance? These questions do not obey reason. They linger in survivors long after the world has told them they are fortunate, and beneath those questions is often a quieter one, harder to admit. Who was I before that day, and who was I allowed to become afterward? Columbine did not merely injure bodies, it interrupted identities. It forced young people to rebuild themselves around memories no teenagers should have had to contain. The statements of teachers and staff carry a different weight, but one just as devastating. A school is a place where adults are meant to protect. Teachers do not walk into classrooms imagining that the mechanics of their profession will be replaced by triage, barricades, and final decisions made under gunfire. For educators caught inside Columbine, the day became a violent betrayal of vocation. The routines of instruction, attendance guidance, and care shattered in minutes. Staff members later described confusion at first, then the sickening dawning comprehension that this was not an isolated disturbance, but something moving through the building with lethal intention. The teacher who died, and those who survived, became part of a deeper national grief because they represented one of the oldest moral assumptions about schools: that adults in those walls stand between the young and danger. At Columbine, danger moved too fast and too mercilessly for any such assumption to remain intact. Even those who survived had to live with the knowledge that they had been asked, in an instant, to protect children against something no teacher had been trained to confront in that form. Parents, too, gave statements that belonged to the emotional record of Columbine, though theirs often came after the event, after the waiting, after the reunification centers, after the names began to separate the living from the dead. No parent speaks from a neutral place after losing a child. Their words come from inside a wound that language cannot really close. Yet what is striking in many family statements from Columbine is not only grief, but the stubborn insistence on the individuality of the children taken. Families tried again and again to push back against the flattening force of public tragedy. The dead were not symbols first. They were sons, daughters, friends, students, people with habits and laughter and unfinished plans. A parent remembers the way a child left a jacket on a chair. A sibling remembers a voice through a bedroom door. A friend remembers an expression in the cafeteria the week before. Public catastrophe has a tendency to turn human beings into categories: victims, survivors, deceased. The families resisted that with memory. In speaking their loved ones aloud, they restored texture to lives the news could only summarize. And in that restoration lies one of the most important statements any tragedy produces. The people lost were specific. They had favorite songs, disliked chores, private jokes, ambitions that had not yet reached their full shape. They were not born to become examples in a national argument. They were born to keep living. Among the most haunting elements in survivor and family testimony is the persistence of the ordinary. People remember what now seems unbearable in its normality. A packed lunch, a homework complaint, a promise to be home later. A casual goodbye delivered with no weight because no one knew it might be the last. In the aftermath of Columbine, many families would revisit those ordinary moments with almost reverent pain. The last words exchanged that morning could have been impatient, distracted routine. That is how life usually works. We do not deliver every goodbye as though the universe were listening for its finality. We assume return. After a mass killing, that assumption is gone, and with it goes a whole innocent structure of daily life. This is why family statements after such events often tremble between memory and regret. Not regret in the sense of guilt, but in the sense that love always feels insufficient once time has been stolen. A parent who hugged a child that morning may still wish it had been longer. A sibling who ignored a joke may wish they had laughed. Trauma rewrites ordinary time into a field of sacred fragments. Survivor testimony also reveals something else, something uncomfortable but deeply human. Memory is inconsistent. Accounts differ. Some students remembered sequences differently. Some recalled words one way, others another. Some were certain of details later shown to be mistaken. This is not evidence of dishonesty. It is evidence of trauma. Under extreme threat, perception narrows and distorts. The body records danger and sensation before the mind can organize it into narrative. Later, survivors try to build coherence from fragments, but fragments remain fragments. This matters because Columbine quickly became a media event, and media hunger often demands clean stories from broken people. Teenagers fresh from terror were asked to explain the unexplainable, to give shape to events still exploding inside their own nervous systems. Some would later carry not only the trauma of what happened, but the burden of having their early, imperfect statements replayed, interpreted, or folded into national mythology. There is something cruel in that too, the demand that the wounded become narrators before they have even fully survived the moment being described. And yet they spoke. They spoke because silence was impossible, because questions came, because families needed facts, because the country wanted meaning, because memory insists on witness. Their statements form one of the most intimate records of Columbine. Not the grand debates, not the policy papers, not the endless analysis of motive, but the human record of fear, loss, confusion, and endurance. There are recurring emotional notes in these accounts. Disbelief is one, another is helplessness, another is the strange intimacy of shared terror. Students hiding together became, for those minutes, something more than classmates. They became witnesses to each other's mortality. Friendships forged in ordinary teenage ways were suddenly branded by the knowledge that each had seen the other at the edge of death. Some survivors later described a sense of isolation afterward, even while surrounded by public sympathy, because ordinary conversation could not hold what they had experienced. How does one return to homework, to prom, to future plans, after crouching in a place where death moved past within arm's reach? How does one sit in a classroom again and hear a dropped book without feeling the body react first? How does one grow up when part of you has been trapped in a single day? Many of those who survived Columbine had to learn that trauma does not end when the shooting stops. It continues in sleep, in sound, in anniversaries, in sudden panics, in survivor's guilt, in depression. In the slow and sometimes uneven work of stitching together a life that history has already marked. Some would later speak openly about the long shadow of that day. Others would withdraw from public narration. Both responses are forms of truth. No one owes eloquence to pain. The statements that exist, though, reveal how mass violence extends itself beyond the minutes of attack. It colonizes the future. It changes graduation ceremonies, family holidays, birthdays, relationships, choices, identities. It alters the meaning of school buildings, emergency sirens, even spring sunlight. A person who survives such a day does not simply remember it, they carry it in the architecture of expectation. The world is no longer assumed safe in the same way. This is equally true for the families of those killed. Their statements, when they came, often had to serve two unbearable purposes at once. They had to mourn, and they had to explain. They had to protect the dignity of the dead while speaking to a nation that wanted narratives. In doing so, many families revealed a kind of courage that is quieter than survival in the moment but no less profound. They stood in front of cameras, or before communities, or in written tributes, and tried to hold their children in language without letting the violence define them completely. It is one thing to lose someone. It is another to lose them in a way the whole country will remember. Public grief can be strangely lonely. Everyone knows the name of the event, but only the family knows the absent laugh in the kitchen, the clothes still in drawers, the unfinished life suspended in a bedroom that no longer makes sense. Columbine's victim statements, then, are not a single speech but a mosaic of voices: students who hid, students who ran, students who were wounded, teachers who tried to comprehend the incomprehensible, parents who searched, waited, hoped, then broke, friends who had to become custodians of memory before they were old enough to understand how memory can hurt. Together these voices tell the emotional truth of the event more powerfully than any timeline alone. They reveal that beneath the public symbol of Columbine there were individual human beings experiencing fear in real time, not as a concept, but as breath, sound, motion, and silence. They show how love persists even in the vocabulary of loss. They show how trauma resists tidy storytelling. They show how the dead remain vividly alive in the minds of those who knew them, and how survivors continue the impossible labor of living forward while carrying a dague that tried to stop time altogether. In the end, the victim's statement at Columbine is larger than any one testimony. It is the collective insistence that what happened there was not an abstraction. It happened to real children, to a real teacher, to real families, inside a real school on a bright spring day. It happened to people who had names before they had memorials, who had dreams before they had obituaries, who had voices before those voices were cut off or changed forever. To listen to those voices now is not simply to revisit tragedy. It is to honor the human scale of it, the trembling, stubborn fact that inside one of the most infamous crimes in American history were individuals trying to survive, to understand, to grieve, and to speak from within the wreckage of a morning that began like any other and ended with a silence none of them had ever imagined. By the time the violence at Columbine High School fully revealed itself, the morning had already crossed that invisible threshold where ordinary time could no longer be recovered. What came next unfolded with the sickening speed of disaster, and yet, for those caught inside it, each second seemed to expand into something cruelly slow, as though the building itself had begun trapping moments and stretching them thin. The attack did not announce itself with any solemn warning. It arrived in fragments, in sounds first mistaken for something smaller, and movement first dismissed as confusion, in the human hesitation that so often gives catastrophe its first advantage. Students were outside on the grass, in the cafeteria, in hallways, in classrooms, moving through the loose rhythm of a school day. Lunch periods have their own atmosphere in any high school. Even when classes have structure, lunch has drift. It is the part of the day when teenagers become most fully themselves, when conversations loosen, when cliques reform, when jokes travel between tables, when private embarrassment or joy can briefly outweigh the dull machinery of education. That atmosphere still hung over Columbine in those first minutes. There was noise, routine motion, backpacks dragging slightly against shoulders, the smell of food in the cafeteria, sunlight falling across concrete and windows. Nothing in those textures suggested that death was about to stride through them. Then the illusion tore. At first the sounds did not arrange themselves into certainty. Sudden violence rarely does. A pop can be mistaken for a prank. A scream can be absorbed into general noise. A figure moving quickly can still appear harmless until context rushes in behind it. But context came fast. The attack began outside, where students were exposed not only to the gunfire itself but to the incomprehension that accompanies first contact with something impossible. Some were shot before their minds had caught up with what was happening. Others began running almost reflexively, not because they fully understood but because the body understands panic earlier than language does. On a school campus, the sight of other students running is contagious. One person bolts, then another, and suddenly fear moves across open space like wind across water. But not everyone runs at once. Some freeze, some turn to look, some crouch, some try to help someone already down. In those early moments, the difference between life and death could be measured in instinct, proximity, angle, chance. Outside, the attack shattered the everyday visual order of the campus. Open grounds that had belonged to passing periods and lunch breaks became places of exposure. Teenagers who had expected only to reach the next class or the next conversation suddenly found themselves seeking walls, curbs, corners. Any interruption in the open geometry of the school grounds that might hide them from bullets. The weather, so calm and indifferent, only deepened the horror. There was no storm to match the violence, no darkness to dramatize the danger. The day remained bright, and that brightness made everything more surreal. A normal spring sky above, gunfire below. Ordinary Colorado light falling on scenes no American schoolchild should ever have had to witness. Students stumbled, ran, fell, rose again, some driven by sheer terror, others by the urgent need to pull someone else out of danger. One of the lasting cruelties of Columbine is that so much of the terror happened in places meant for movement, spaces that offered little shelter and even less time to think. Those outside were caught in a brutal equation of visibility and speed. Those who made it into the building did not escape the danger. They carried it inside with them. Panic travels faster indoors. A hallway takes fear and sharpens it. Footsteps echo, voices multiply. A shouted warning can become distorted before it reaches the far end of a corridor. Doors open, faces appear, confused. Someone says there is shooting outside. Someone else says get down. Someone does not believe it yet. That hesitation, repeated across classrooms and corridors, formed part of the tragedy. A school is a place trained to interpret noise through familiar categories. Fire drills, horseplay, slammed lockers, false alarms, adolescent chaos. The mind does not leap easily from school day disorder to massacre, but once the truth breached that resistance, the building changed instantly, always became channels of escape. Classrooms became shelters or traps depending on whether doors locked, whether lights were turned off, whether students had time to hide. The library, one of the central places of refuge inside a school, would become the most haunting symbol of the day. But before that, the attack moved through the campus like a force both erratic and deliberate, producing confusion not only among students and staff but among the first authorities trying to understand the shape of what was unfolding. In the cafeteria, the sounds of lunch and teenage conversation gave way to alarm and abandonment. A cafeteria during school hours is an almost aggressively social place, full of trays, voices, movement, the clatter of chairs, the smell of food and detergent, and heated air. To imagine it suddenly emptied by fear is already chilling. To imagine the evidence of panic left behind is worse. Food dropped half-eaten, chairs knocked sideways. Personal belongings abandoned in the rush to survive. The attack's early phase pushed people in multiple directions at once. Some fled outward, some sought classrooms. Some hid beneath tables or against walls. Some were wounded before they could reach safety. What had been a shared public space for teenage routine was transformed into a landscape of split-second decisions. Elsewhere in the building, teachers and staff were forced to navigate impossible uncertainty. A teacher hearing commotion from a hallway has only moments to choose between investigating, securing students, or seeking help. Adults in schools are trained by habit to move toward disturbance, to restore order, to protect. But this was not disruption in any normal sense. It was violence on a scale few school employees in 1999 had been prepared to imagine, let alone confront. Some tried to gather students into classrooms. Others attempted to assess what was happening. Some became lifelines, directing children toward safety even as they themselves were still operating on partial information. The terrifying thing about an incident like Columbine is that knowledge was unevenly distributed. In one room, students may have known immediately that there was gunfire. In another, they may have heard only screaming and rumors. On one end of a hallway, people may have seen the danger directly. On the other, they were still trying to decode it. A massacre inside a school produces not one single experience, but many simultaneous realities. Some are running, some are hiding, some are wounded. Some are still sitting in class thinking an announcement will explain it all. And then there was the library. In the years since Columbine, the library has become almost inseparable from the memory of the massacre, not only because of the number of lives lost there, but because it embodied the terrible inversion at the center of the event. A library is supposed to be one of the quietest rooms in a school. It is built for attention, for study, for shelter from noise. Students go there to finish assignments, to browse shelves, to think, sometimes simply to disappear into a place where the rest of the school cannot so easily reach them. On April 20th, that room became a chamber of fear. Students and staff gathered there because it seemed safer than the open campus or exposed hallways. They ducked beneath tables, pressed themselves small, tried to disappear in a room full of books and sunlight and the unbearable sound of danger approaching. There is something especially heartbreaking about the way survivors later describe those moments, the cramped hiding places, the stillness forced upon frightened bodies, the sense that every scrape or breath might matter. The incident inside the library was not simply a continuation of the attack. It was its emotional core, the place where the massacre's intimacy became impossible to ignore. In a large public tragedy, there are always moments that history remembers because they concentrate the event's horror into one room, one image, one sound. At Columbine, the library became that room. It held students who had done what schools teach children to do in danger: hide, get low, stay quiet, wait for help. Yet help did not arrive in time for many inside. What followed was terror at close range, fear measured not in abstract threat but in footsteps, gunfire, the crash of violence inside a room meant for learning. The day's most painful losses gathered there not because the room invited danger, but because it had seemed for a few desperate moments like refuge. That cruel reversal lies at the heart of the incident. Places of safety became places of death. Across the campus, outside the library and beyond the building itself, the emergency response was beginning to form under the pressure of fragmentary information. Sirens were converging. Law enforcement officers were arriving into a scene that still refused easy interpretation. Reports came in fast and incompletely. There were shooters. There were bombs. There were injured students outside. There might be more attackers. In any unfolding crisis, first response is shaped by uncertainty. And Columbine produced uncertainty in great, choking volumes. Officers moved toward the school while students fled from it. Parents began arriving, frantic, looking not for the overall truth but for a single face, a single child, a single sign that their family had not been split open by what was happening. Helicopters circled. News crews began to gather. The school, which had hours earlier belonged only to its own community, was becoming a national spectacle even before the full reality had been contained. Inside, that outside attention meant nothing to those still hiding. For them the world had narrowed to sound, breath, prayer, pain, and the hope that the next moment might not be the last. The movement of the attack through the building and campus created a pattern of terror that was both chaotic and devastatingly focused. One of the reasons Columbine marked the American consciousness so deeply is that it seemed to make a school porous to death in every direction. Violence outside, violence in hallways, violence in the library, students escaping through doors and windows, others unable to escape at all. There was no single front line, no simple path to safety that everyone could see. The building's very layout became part of the ordeal. Rooms that might have saved one group trapped another. Visibility vanished and returned unpredictably. Fire alarms, smoke, broken glass, shouted warnings, scattered bodies, all of it folded together into a sensory landscape of confusion. Students were forced to read that landscape in real time with no map and no training for what they were seeing. It is impossible to overstate the psychological violence of that transformation. 1 minute a school is a familiar environment whose meaning has been stable for years. The next it becomes unrecognizable, a maze in which every ordinary object acquires a new and terrible significance. Tables become shields. Doors become lifelines. Windows become escape routes. Silence becomes strategy. Noise becomes danger. Even the intercom and the alarms mechanisms meant to organize school life became part of the chaos. Reminders that the systems built for order were helpless before the scale of what had entered the building. Eventually the attack burned toward its end, but endings in such events are not clean. They do not arrive with moral closure. They arrive with exhaustion, smoke, unanswered questions, and the horrible lag between the final act of violence and the moment everyone outside can be certain it has stopped. Those still hiding could not know when the threat had passed. Those outside could not know exactly what was still unfolding inside. Rescue and recovery moved forward under the weight of uncertainty and the possibility of more danger. Students emerging alive did not emerge into relief so much as shock. They came out with their hands up, with faces drained of color, with clothes marked by dust, blood, or the dull evidence of hiding. Some were sobbing, some looked blank. Some had already entered that first hard shell of trauma where feeling becomes numbness simply because the body cannot contain anything more. The parents waiting beyond police lines searched those faces with the rawest form of hope. Each child who emerged was a miracle for one family and, by implication, a tightening dread for another. This was the outer edge of the incident, the part the world saw most clearly. Teenagers running from the building, police taking positions, ambulances staged nearby, helicopters recording the scene from above. But even those unforgettable images only hinted at the private scale of what had occurred inside. By the end of the attack, 12 students and 1 teacher were dead. Many others were physically wounded. Far more were wounded in ways that would not show on television, wounds of memory, fear, and identity that would continue long after the campus was cleared. The perpetrators, having torn through the school and altered the course of American life, died by suicide before they could be brought to trial or forced to account for what they had done. In one sense, that ended the immediate violence. In another, it began a different one. The violence of aftermath, of grief, investigation, myth-blame policy, and the long national attempt to understand what had happened in a place that looked, until that day, so cruelly ordinary. But the incident itself remains fixed in memory not as one seamless narrative but as a sequence of ruptures. A bright school morning, sudden gunfire, students running across open ground, hallways filling with panic, a cafeteria emptied by fear, a library turned into a place of slaughter, sirens converging, parents waiting, survivors climbing out into daylight that no longer felt innocent. That was the incident at Columbine. Not merely a shooting, not only an attack, but the violent collapse of routine into nightmare. Carried out in the heart of a school where children had arrived expecting classes and lunch and ordinary life. and where by afternoon the country would see, with terrible clarity, that one building in Colorado had become the site of a national wound. When the gunfire finally stopped, Columbine High School did not become quiet in any peaceful sense. It entered a different kind of noise, the noise of aftermath, where radios crackled, sirens pulsed, helicopters beat the air overhead, and commands were spoken in clipped voices by people trying to force order onto a scene that had been torn apart too quickly to comprehend. Inside the building, however, beneath that urgent machinery of response, there was another atmosphere entirely. It was the stillness left by violence, the kind that seems to cling to walls, furniture, broken glass, and abandoned belongings, as if the building itself has not yet understood what has happened within it. A school is not built to hold massacre. Its surfaces are made for routine contact, for hands opening doors, for shoes carrying students from class to class, for library tables supporting notebooks and elbows, for cafeteria floors absorbing spilled milk and the ordinary debris of lunch. At Columbine, those same surfaces had been transformed into witnesses. The crime scene was not one room alone, not one contained pocket of destruction. It was a chain of places connected by fear, movement, and interrupted life. The grounds outside, the cafeteria, the hallways, the library, each bore part of the event's imprint, and each carried a different emotional weight. Investigators, entering such a scene, do not encounter only evidence. They encounter the residue of ordinary life split open in the middle of itself. Backpacks were still where they had been dropped. Books and papers lay scattered across floors that had only hours earlier held the regular traffic of a school day. Chairs were overturned, glass was broken, doors stood open or damaged. In some places there were signs of frantic escape, the quick disorder of people fleeing without time to think about what they left behind. In others there was a more terrible stillness, the stillness of spaces where people had hidden, waited, prayed, or died. No matter how many procedures exist for documenting a major crime scene, there remains something profoundly human and disturbing about walking into a school and seeing the evidence of violence laid over objects associated with youth. A pencil near a pool of blood, a notebook open to unfinished classwork, a jacket left slung over the back of a chair as though its owner might return in a few minutes. Those details matter because they restore scale. They remind everyone who enters that this was not an abstract battlefield. It was a place of adolescence, interrupted mid-sentence. Outside on the grounds, the first impressions were shaped by exposure and suddenness. The exterior areas showed where panic had erupted under open sky, where students had been caught in the first terrible phase of the attack, where some had fallen and others had run. The campus itself, with its familiar pathways and open spaces, became part of the evidence map. Distances mattered, angles mattered, lines of sight mattered. Investigators would have to reconstruct where people had been standing, moving, or attempting to hide when the attack began. But before reconstruction came raw observation. Blood on concrete has a different emotional force than blood indoors. Under daylight, with the normal life of the world still visible beyond it, it looks almost accusatory. A stain not only against the ground but against the idea that such a place should ever have contained such violence. Witnesses had fled across those spaces in confusion and terror. Some had seen others collapse before their minds fully grasped what they were seeing. By the time investigators began processing the outdoor areas, those spaces no longer belonged to movement and conversation. They had become marked terrain, each point fixed by the memory of where someone had fallen, where someone had tried to help, where someone had turned and run. Inside the school, the cafeteria offered one kind of truth about the attack. It was a communal room emptied in haste, a place whose size and openness made it feel less like a room after the attack than like a stage abandoned in the middle of a performance. Cafeterias always hold signs of life, even in the quietest moments. Trays, tables, food containers, chairs at uneven angles, bulletin boards, vending machines, all of it speaks of crowds' appetite, impatience, laughter, and the democratic mess of daily student life. After the attack, that same room became a study in interruption. What remained behind was the evidence of how abruptly normality had been severed. Items were left half-used, half-held, half-finished. The room looked less destroyed by time than abandoned by necessity, as though life had fled and left its shape behind. For investigators, the cafeteria also carried another significance. It contained some of the earliest clues about planning and intention, clues that suggested this was not simply a spontaneous burst of violence, but part of something broader, something conceived in advance. The scene offered evidence that would force responders to consider not only gunfire but the possibility of explosives, secondary devices, and a wider attack pattern than initially understood. That possibility changed everything. A crime scene already soaked in fear became more dangerous still because every bag, every container, every unexplained object could no longer be read innocently. Schools are full of unattended things: backpacks, gym bags, lunch sacks, projects, musical instrument cases. But once investigators recognized that explosives were part of the design, the ordinary clutter of school life became threatening. Objects had to be treated with suspicion. Bomb technicians had to enter a place that, until that day, had been associated with lockers and cafeterias and study halls, not with the logic of a war zone. The library held the emotional center of the crime scene, and perhaps the most enduring one. Even before the public knew the full details, it became clear that the library had been transformed from a refuge into the deadliest room in the building. A library after school hours is usually quiet in a benign way. A library after mass violence is quiet in another register entirely. The silence there is not restful. It feels pressed down, burdened, as though sound itself has withdrawn in the presence of what took place. Investigators entering the library would have encountered not only the physical evidence of shooting, injury, and death, but the disturbing contradiction between the room's purpose and its condition. Tables that had been meant for study had become hiding places. Shelves meant to organize knowledge stood witness to terror at close range. Chairs were no longer simple furniture, but markers of where people had crouched, sheltered, or been trapped. Windows and walls carried their own record. The room would need to be processed with forensic discipline. Every casing, every impact, every bloodstain documented carefully, every body position mapped, every trajectory examined. But the human reality of the room could not be erased by procedure. This was where students had tried to make themselves small enough to survive. This was where fear had become intimate, measured not in distant threat but in proximity. Even the arrangement of the room, the spacing of the tables, the pathways between shelves, mattered now in a way no one would ever again consider innocent. What had once been familiar architecture became part of the crime's anatomy. The library's condition also provided some of the earliest and most painful clues about how the attack had unfolded moment by moment. Forensic work is, in part, the disciplined struggle against chaos. Investigators read the scene the way others read a shattered narrative, not because the scene speaks clearly, but because every object, stain, angle, and wound contributes to a sequence that must be rebuilt. In the library, the positions of the dead and wounded, the distribution of shell casings, the patterns of impact, the damage to furniture, and the presence of unexploded devices all helped sketch the movement of the perpetrators and the experience of those trapped inside. Yet forensic clarity always arrives too late for the people who suffered through the event. It can explain pathways, distances, timing. It cannot restore what those minutes felt like for the frightened young people crouched beneath tables, hearing footsteps and gunfire close enough to make every breath seem dangerous. The initial clues investigators encountered were not only physical. They came as fragments of witness testimony, radio reports, emergency calls, and the statements of dazed survivors emerging into daylight. In any major crime, especially one unfolding in real time, early information is messy, it overlaps, contradicts itself, and shifts as perception catches up with reality. At Columbine, that confusion was magnified by the scale of panic and the complexity of the attack. There were reports of multiple gunmen, reports of bombs, reports of shots from different locations, reports shaped by terror and limited sightlines. Students who had just fled the building described what they thought they had seen, but trauma narrows vision and distorts time. Their statements were vital, yet necessarily incomplete. Law enforcement had to move through that fog while also treating the campus as an active and potentially unstable crime scene. This meant that the first clues were filtered through fear, and fear is both truthful and imperfect. It tells you danger is real. It does not always tell you exactly how danger is arranged. One of the most important early realizations was that this was not just a shooting but an attack involving multiple methods, including explosives that had been placed and, in some cases, failed to function as intended. That discovery altered the entire meaning of the crime scene. It suggested not a simple rampage in the narrow sense, but a broader plan whose intended destruction may have been even greater than the death toll already indicated. The presence of explosive devices forced investigators to think in layers. The visible dead and wounded were only one part of the scene. There was also the unseen threat, the possibility that additional devices remained active or hidden. That possibility slowed entry, complicated rescue, and deepened the sense that the school had become hostile in ways no one could immediately measure. Every hallway, every bag, every corner had to be approached with caution. There is something particularly chilling about bombs in a school because bombs erase the distinction between target and bystander even more completely than gunfire does. They belong to the logic of mass casualty, of indiscriminate ruin. Their presence at Columbine made clear early on that the attack had not been aimed only at specific individuals in a passing fit of rage. It had been conceived with broader devastation in mind. Initial clues also emerged from the perpetrator's own traces, from what they had brought, worn, carried, and left behind. Crime scenes often contain a strange intimacy in that way. The offender enters with intention and leaves fragments of himself scattered through the environment. At Columbine, those traces would become central to reconstructing not only what had happened, but how long it had been planned and how its steps had been imagined in advance. Weapons, ammunition, devices, placements, all these details suggested preparation rather than impulse. Yet even as investigators began assembling those clues, the world outside the school was already generating its own versions of explanation. Rumor spreads faster than forensic certainty. The public wanted immediate answers. The media wanted a frame. The community wanted to know why. But inside the school, in the actual crime scene, why was still hidden beneath the more urgent task of what and how. The physical evidence had to be read before motive could be responsibly discussed. The tragedy, however, was that the evidence pointed to something emotionally unbearable, that the violence had been not only ferocious but planned with enough care to exploit routine timing and the ordinary vulnerabilities of a school day. Hallways throughout the building contributed their own clues. Schools are corridor worlds. Hallways carry noise, gossip, boredom, authority, flirtation, impatience, all the countless brief exchanges that make up student life. At Columbine, those same corridors became channels of flight and fear. Investigators had to chart movement through them, determine where shots had been fired, where people had run, where doors had been opened or shut, where possible lines of pursuit or escape existed. Broken glass, dropped belongings, spent casings, blood trails, all these helped create a map of motion. Hallways after violence feel especially exposed because they are transitional spaces by design. No one is meant to remain in them long. They are for getting from one safe room to another. When violence enters a hallway, it infects the very idea of passage. There is nowhere to settle, nowhere to disappear except behind doors that may or may not open in time. The clues found there reflected that vulnerability. They told stories of interrupted movement, of people trying to reach somewhere safer and not always making it. The broader crime scene also held a painful temporal clue, the evidence of how much of school life had been underway when the attack interrupted it. Clocks still marked time. Lesson materials remained in classrooms. Lunch debris sat where it had been left. A school massacre is not only an attack on bodies, it is an attack on sequence, on the expected rhythm of a day. Crime scene investigators do not formally process a broken schedule or a future that stopped, yet those absences are present in every school shooting scene. Columbine's initial clues spoke in that language too. The building was full of moments that had been in progress and never completed. That is part of why the scene affected not only those tasked with documenting it, but the nation watching from outside. There was something uniquely distressing about seeing the tools of ordinary education surrounded by the evidence of calculated destruction. The initial forensic picture that emerged from Columbine would eventually become far more detailed through autopsies, ballistic analysis, timelines, video evidence, witness interviews, recovered writings, and extensive investigative review. But in those first hours, the scene itself had already yielded its most terrible truths. Students and a teacher were dead inside a school. Many others had been wounded. The perpetrators were dead by suicide. Guns had been used. Explosive devices had been planted. The library had been the epicenter of slaughter. The attack had begun in public, in daylight, against a campus moving through ordinary life. Those were the early anchors, the first fixed points in a disaster, initially obscured by panic. Around those anchors, everything else would be built: the investigation, the public understanding, the myths, the corrections, the policy shifts, the grief. But before all of that, there was the crime scene itself, holding in one building the broken grammar of a day that should have remained ordinary. There were books and blood, lunch trays and evidence markers, lockers and shattered windows, sunlight and death. There were clues, yes, but they were embedded in something larger than procedure. They were embedded in the visible fact that a school had been made to look like a place it was never supposed to resemble. That is what investigators first faced at Columbine. Not only a puzzle to solve, but a landscape of violated innocence, where the initial clues did not merely point toward perpetrators and methods, but toward a harder realization that this crime had changed the meaning of the building itself, and perhaps the meaning of American school safety, before the last body had even been removed. In the first hours after the attack at Columbine High School, suspicion did not move in a straight line. It spread the way fear always spreads after public violence, rapidly and evenly attaching itself to fragments, rumors, silhouettes, reputations, half-remembered incidents, and the desperate human need to believe that if investigators could only identify the correct type of person, the whole thing might become understandable. But atrocity does not surrender so easily. In the chaos surrounding Columbine, law enforcement officers, students, teachers, parents, and the media were all wrestling with the same unbearable question: who did this? And just as urgently, was it over? The first problem with a massacre inside a large school is that everyone becomes both witness and unreliable narrator at once. Teenagers fleeing gunfire do not emerge with orderly statements. They come out shaking, sobbing, gasping, their minds clinging to flashes of clothing, voices, height, movement, the shape of a weapon, the impression of how many figures they saw. At Columbine, these first accounts produced a blur of possible suspects. There were reports of more than one attacker, then reports suggesting there could be several. There were descriptions shaped by panic, by the briefness of what had been seen, by the speed with which terror strips away detail and leaves only the most vivid edges. In those early hours, every rumor carried weight because the possibility of additional attackers was not just a matter of curiosity. It was a matter of survival. If more gunmen were still inside, if others had escaped, if accomplices were waiting elsewhere, then the danger remained active. And the perimeter around the school was not merely a boundary around a crime scene, but around an unfinished threat. This uncertainty shaped everything that followed. It shaped how officers approached the building, how investigators questioned survivors, how parents interpreted every delay, and how journalists began constructing a story before the truth had even settled into one coherent shape. Columbine was not only a massacre, it was a mass confusion event, one in which the search for suspects unfolded through layers of misinformation before it reached the harder, darker certainty beneath. The two perpetrators would eventually be identified clearly, but in the beginning, the suspect pool existed in the emotional logic of a wounded community. Students began naming those who seemed to fit a certain image. Familiar school archetypes rushed to the surface: outsiders, angry boys, socially marginalized teenagers, members of visible subcultures, youth who dressed differently, moved differently, or had once frightened classmates with dark jokes or theatrical threats. In the aftermath of a school attack, people often searched their memory for the person who already seemed dangerous in ordinary time: the student who wore a long coat, the boy who wrote something disturbing in class, the teenager who stared too long, talked too coldly, laughed at the wrong moment. Some of these recollections are meaningful. Others are acts of retrospective pattern-making, the mind stitching together a villain from scraps that only look prophetic after blood has been spilled. Columbine became one of the clearest examples of how quickly a school community, and then a nation, can begin turning teenage culture itself into a suspect. The late 1990s were already full of adult anxiety about youth subcultures. Alternative music, trench coats, violent games, gothic aesthetics, black clothing, alienation as style, all of it was ripe for suspicion in a country eager to locate evil in visible symbols. So, when Columbine happened, the first instinct in many circles was not simply to identify the actual perpetrators, but to identify the tribe from which such perpetrators must have come. This is how moral panic enters an investigation. It begins by confusing image with motive and style with causation. Within Columbine High School, there had been social groups whose members dressed in ways that set them apart, and some of these groups quickly became the subject of scrutiny. Students mentioned names, cliques, reputations. One label in particular rose fast in the public imagination, not because it neatly explained the crime, but because it offered something that frightened adults could hold in their hands: a visible, cinematic symbol of menace. It was easier to fear a coat than a mind, easier to blame a subculture than confront the possibility that the roots of mass violence might be more intimate, more psychologically disturbing, and more difficult to predict. Investigators, meanwhile, had to work inside this storm without surrendering to it. The dead-end phase of the Columbine investigation began almost immediately because early appearances invited misleading conclusions. The perpetrators were indeed students connected to the school, but what they represented could not be accurately captured by the first flood of assumptions. Some witnesses believed they had seen 3 shooters, others thought there might be even more. Certain names began circulating that would later prove unrelated or only tangentially relevant. Some students feared friends, acquaintances, or members of fringe social circles simply because those individuals had once seemed angry, theatrical, or obsessed with violent imagery. Under pressure, rumor behaves like evidence to the desperate. A student says he heard someone threaten the school weeks earlier. Another says a certain group hated athletes. A third swears she saw someone in a hallway who does not match the final timeline. Each fragment demands attention. Each fragment also risks dragging investigators into blind corridors. In the first phase of any mass casualty